You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Sputnik News reports UK Treasury reportedly admits no more money for defense as Army runs out of ammo. Late last month, a senior U.S. general reportedly told UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace that the British Army is no longer considered a top-level fighting force. The UK Treasury has no more money for the country's defense, even though it admits there is an urgent need to rearm in the wake of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. How serious of a problem is this? I called for a war and my allies came, but had no bullets. This is a new definition of BYOB. Bring your own bullets. For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores chairs of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, BYOB, I'm calling for a war, but please bring your own bullets. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, the miscalculation on the part of the North Atlantic countries is both specific and general. With regard to the general, it's apparent that they underestimated Russia. They underestimated the global correlation of forces, that is to say, Russia, not only backed by a good deal of the global South, but by the number two country, that is China. They underestimated history. Insofar as we've said many times on this program, as the Western European nations were moving westward to exploit the Americas and get fat, Russia was not involved in that process. It was moving eastward. And so you had this anomaly of Western European countries being dominant globally, but not in their backyard. They try to resolve that contradiction by repeatedly attacking Russia, not only with regard to Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century, but also London financing Japan at the beginning of the 20th century. But they also thought, wrongly in retrospect, that if they could just get rid of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that would resolve this contradiction. But it has not, obviously. And then there's the specific, that is to say that with this underestimation of Russia comes an underestimation of Russia's capability to produce militarily, because since it's perpetually under threat and has been so for centuries, it has found it necessary to build up a kind of defense and military capability. And so as their factories are operating virtually around the clock to supply artillery shells and the like, the North Atlantic countries find that on the one hand, they're telling us that China is the whole ballgame. Recall what's happened in the past 48 hours with this balloonacy, this heightening of tensions over this Chinese balloon floating over North America, and how it is ratcheting up tensions. And yet, as they tell us on the one hand that they want to go mano a mano with Beijing, on the other hand, they're flailing and failing against Russia. This is an irreconcilable contradiction, and it does not bode well for the continued hegemony of the North Atlantic countries.
Well, Dr. Horne, not only are they having difficulty on the military front, they may have woken a sleeping giant in the form of workers and working class people, particularly starting with Western Europe. We see that there are massive workers' rallies across the UK defending the right to strike, and at the same time, there are massive protests against pension changes. So there seems to be a grassroots pushback against neoliberal capitalism that was sparked by, I would argue, the results of these sanctions. Your thoughts on all of that, Dr. Horne?
Well, first of all, with regard to Great Britain, pay careful and close attention to the International Monetary Fund report issued quite recently, which suggests that Russian economic growth in 2023 will outstrip that of Great Britain. Now, there are many reasons for Great Britain falling behind. There is the hegemony of capital, the disproportionate domination of the 1% as represented by the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who has a fortune estimated at about £800 million. But it's also the fact that London decided some years ago to tie its apron strings to that of Uncle Sam. And as is well known, Uncle Sam does not necessarily have partners and allies, it has vassals. And so London has had to pay the price for being a vassal of Uncle Sam. And then if you cross the channel to France, you see that President Macron obviously doesn't understand his own country. He does not understand the clear and true revolutionary traditions of France going back to the late 18th century. And the fact that in recent weeks you've had millions of workers rallying across the country, across the hexagonal nation, on behalf of their basic rights, including the right to retire at the age of 62, which sounds like a pipe dream here in the headquarters of monopoly capital, speaking of the United States of America. And therefore, you also see that this is going to weaken the escapade of the North Atlantic nations in Ukraine, because ultimately workers in both Britain and France will be asking the question of why are our tax dollars going down a rat hole in Kyiv at a time when it is considered to be, speaking of Ukraine, one of the most corrupt nations on planet Earth. And yet at the same time, you have workers in Britain, workers in France who are starving. So obviously this makes no sense, and it does not bode well, as noted, for the continued hegemony of the North Atlantic nations.
There's what I think is a very interesting development just this past Sunday. Parliament approves agreement allows Egypt to join Brics Group's new development bank. Members of Parliament approved Sunday an agreement that allows Egypt to officially join the new development bank to be set up by the Brics economic group, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This is of interest to me, looking at the relationship that the Obama administration had with Egypt, supporting President al-Sisi, and that now Egypt seems to be going a different direction.
Well, that's for sure. As a matter of fact, there's a stampede to join the Brics right now. I'm sure you've seen the headlines about the Saudis attempting to make an application as well. And as we well know, the al-Sisi regime in Cairo perhaps would have collapsed a long time ago, but for being propped up by the Saudis. And then we know about the Turkish or Turkey application as well. Keep in mind that relations between Turkey and the North Atlantic countries are rather complicated right now in light of the fact that Turkey, despite supplying drones to Ukraine, also has been a lucrative trading partner of Russia in putative violations of U.S. sanctions. The latest news is that the United States will seek to penalize Turkey by not allotting it a complement of advanced fighter jets, which is rather ironic since Turkey is the eastern flank of NATO, and in a sense, the United States is shooting NATO in the foot. And then there's Indonesia, by some measures, the largest predominantly Muslim country on planet Earth, a close ally of China. In fact, your listeners should know that you cannot begin to understand the rise of the People's Republic of China in recent decades without understanding the role of the Chinese diaspora, not only in Philippines and Southeast Asia generally, but also in Indonesia. And that has caused a lot of counter-reaction. Historically, you've had pogroms against the Chinese-Indonesian population, with the mysterious hidden hand of Washington oftentimes being espied in this devilish, diabolical, dastardly process. And so there is a lot of anti-U.S., anti-Yankee sentiment in Indonesia, which also tends to suggest that Indonesia, too, will be in the front ranks of those stampeding to join the Brics. But Egypt, as your headline suggests, is perhaps a bigger story, given its role with regard to the so-called Middle East crisis, the Palestinian question, given the fact that it's one of the biggest economies on the African continent. In some ways, it complements the membership in Brics of South Africa as the southern pole of the continent, with Egypt weighing into the northern pole of the continent. And in some ways, it's thumbing its nose, as you suggested, in Uncle Sam, because after these decades where Uncle Sam thought that Cairo was its bosom buddy, you see Cairo saying, thank you very much, but we're on our way.
Something that's interesting that's happening in Germany. There is as I've called it, rather than the elephant in the room, the blue whale in the phone booth. That the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. That there's significant evidence, but now it's actually being discussed. There was a prominent UK newspaper that had an article, positing that it's possible there could have been some Western countries involved. Sergei Lavrov has certainly taken the opportunity to outright accuse the U.S. of being involved, and we've seen a number of things. But I think it's consequential that conversation is arising in Europe now. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Consequential indeed. Who can forget that press conference that took place with President Biden alongside Chancellor Scholz, where before the conflict in Ukraine, Mr. Biden assured one and all, to the chagrin of Chancellor Scholz, that the Nord Stream pipeline would not be built. And then voila, it's destroyed. And at a recent congressional hearing, State Department official Victoria Nuland basically congratulating and saluting the bombing of this primary way to supply Germany with natural gas. This bespeaks the ever-complicated relations between the largest economy in Europe, speaking of Germany, and its erstwhile master, speaking of the United States. As noted, the United States does not necessarily have partners or allies. It has vassals. And Germany, despite being the fourth or fifth largest economy on planet Earth, is a kind of vassal of the United States. It's causing enormous alarm in Germany because, as we know, there is widespread pacifist and anti-war sentiment in Germany. And at the same time, ears are pricked up in Berlin when at the 80th anniversary of the epical Battle of Stalingrad, noted in Volgograd, once Stalingrad, just a few days ago by President Putin, he pointed directly to this idea that the Russians might be confronting German tanks all over again, just as they confronted German tanks 80-odd years ago on their own soil. So this is a matter of concern, and yet we have the spectacle of a green foreign minister, speaking of Madame Baerbock, who, interestingly enough, instead of pushing for sustainable energy and climate change measures, is pushing for Germany arming and rearming. This is obviously, to coin a phrase, unsustainable, and yet she plunges on.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We greatly, greatly appreciate your analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.